Welcome to API Futures, a podcast by Ascend where we empower global leaders of tomorrow. Earlier this year, Ascend released a study, The Diversity Equity Gap in the Fortune 500, Too Few Racial Minority Executives. The report found that the most diverse of the 244 Fortune 500 companies studied were also the least equitable in terms of advancing racial minorities. We're talking Hispanics, Blacks, and Asian Pacific Islanders, to the higher executive levels. In this episode, we'll talk about becoming comfortable in your own skin as a leader, from Mark Tatum, COO and Deputy Commissioner of the NBA, in conversation with our guest host, Franco Finn, hype man and announcer for the Golden State Warriors.
Hey, I'm Franco Finn. I'm a San Francisco native, born and raised. I have multiple roles and I'm involved in so many different things. Many people know me as the in-arena host and hype man for the NBA Golden State Warriors, and I'm the first and only Asian American and Filipino American hype man and host in the NBA. So that's my fun job, but then also by day, I work at Alaska Airlines, where I manage our community relations, public affairs for the state of California, and also I use my craft and my talents. They all lend itself to all the work that I do in the community, doing fundraisers, events, galas, that sort of thing, as a professional auctioneer as well. So everything kind of ties it together. Obviously very proud to be a member of the AAPI community and to represent that fully during many of my jobs. Today, I'm excited to be in conversation with someone I look up to and I'm so proud of in the NBA, and that is Mark Tatum, who's the COO and Deputy Commissioner. So thanks for being here. Well, your upbringing and past experiences, they shape who we become. And you've got quite a very unique and diverse background, Mark. What was it like growing up as a mixed race and multinational person representing, different ethnicities?
Yeah, no, thank you. There's no doubt about that my story is a big part of obviously what I've become. And it was so monumental in how I was raised. And so my dad grew up in Kingston, Jamaica, in the island of Jamaica. He came to the U.S. when he was a teenager, joined the U.S. Air Force, went to Vietnam during the war, met my mother, fell in love, got married over there, and had me. So I was actually born in Vung Tau, Vietnam in 1969 in the middle of the war. And, one of the most important decisions my dad ever made and was bringing me and my mom back in 1970 back to the United States, where we settled in Brooklyn, New York. And so, I really consider myself fortunate to be one of those children that were born during the Vietnam War that was actually brought back to the U.S. by their American father, who then, by the way, my mom and dad are still married to this day. So they've been married for some, 54 years this year, which is really incredible, and still live in Brooklyn, New York, in the same house that I grew up in. And so really just me being here is a miracle, quite frankly. And, I was raised with these different cultures in my household. There were these two different cultures, and through food and different values with lots of similarities. I think, in both my mom's culture, where she grew up in Vietnam, and my dad in Jamaica, these common values like the work ethic and the importance of education, the importance of respecting your elders, right? Those were important things that were instilled in me and my brothers growing up. And the differences in food. So at our Thanksgiving table, for example, we would have everything from, jerk chicken and rice and peas and plantains and oxtail to pho. And so, it was just this wonderful blend of different cultures that really shaped my perspective. And, the last thing I would say on that is, at that time in the early 70s, for example, that combination of Black, West Indian, and Asian was pretty rare. That was before everyone had heard of Tiger Woods or Naomi Osaka or, Rui Hachimura. It was before there was a term called Blasian that was, widely known out there. And so that was difficult, I would say, as an individual growing up. being from two different cultures, not seeing a lot of people that look like me, and having to answer a lot of questions about, what are you, who are you, and those types of things. So it really did shape who I've become as a person and my perspective on the world.
Oh, Brooklyn is special. Now, you have the Black, immigrant, Afro-Latino, Jewish, Asian. I mean, really, truly a diverse mix here, but it could still have its challenges for a mixed race kid, right? So how did you get through it?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think growing up in Brooklyn was incredibly helpful to me. And, again, back then, it's gotten, I think it's a little bit different today, but back then there were these stark neighborhoods, right? Where the neighborhood I grew up in East Flatbush, it was largely Black, largely West Indian. And so there, that is where I grew up. That's where I went to elementary school. But I did have questions because many of the other kids who were Black, particularly, or West Indian, I didn't look Black, but my dad was Black and I looked Asian. And again, they had never seen someone like me, and I sort of stood out in that neighborhood. But I learned to adapt, and I think what people, and what I, had to always do is try to explain to people who I was as a person and try to get past that. I know you may not understand or may not resonate with you as a fifth grader, like who I am, because I don't fit into that category, but let me share with you who I am as a person, right? And then in junior high school, I actually had the opportunity to go to a junior high school in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, which at the time was all white Italian. And I literally had to take 3 public school buses to get from East Flatbush to Bensonhurst and travel through different neighborhoods to get there. And again, when I showed up there, I didn't look like anybody there either. And so there were these curiosities about, well, who are you and where'd you come from, and having to explain and adapt to that. It wasn't until, quite frankly, I got to high school, Brooklyn Tech High School, where it was truly a melting pot of people from not only Brooklyn, but all 5 boroughs of New York City. And that is where I saw other mixed race kids for the first time, and people who were just comfortable in their own skin. And that's really where I think I came into my own, because people there celebrated the difference. It was, wow, that's cool that you're Black and Asian, and it became there that I became even much more comfortable in my own skin. So it was, I think, those unique experiences in Brooklyn, the way that it was set up, that really forced me to deal with the issues of race at a very early age, and inclusion, quite frankly. And it wasn't until that high school experience where I started really feeling comfortable with it, where people celebrated it. And that was my first real exposure to that. And I think that gave me the confidence to go on and do the things I did after that.
Okay. Well, with that being said, it's one thing to get through these challenges as a kid, but as a young adult, let's talk about that for a little bit. How do we get through it in this workplace? Let's fast forward to your time at maybe a big company like Pepsi when you worked there, or Procter & Gamble, and now the NBA. How do you get through challenges of not being seen, especially at the executive level?
Yeah, I remember that being one of my first reactions, and that was, over 30 years ago when I started my career at Procter & Gamble, and there weren't other people that looked like me. There weren't, quite frankly, a lot of senior Black executives, and there weren't a lot of senior Asian executives. There weren't a lot of senior Latino, Hispanic executives either. But that applied pretty much across the board in corporate America. And it was my first exposure to corporate America because, when I went to college, I actually went as a pre-med student. And then I took organic chemistry, and I quickly changed my mind about pursuing a career in medicine. So I switched into business, and I didn't know what to expect, but it was pretty stark at the time. Now, I would say at Procter, I had generally very positive experiences because P&G was at least aware of the need to have a diverse workplace, and they were starting to really create initiatives. And they, for example, they recruited back then at HBCUs when other institutions weren't really recruiting at HBCUs. They were. Many of my colleagues that I worked with at Proctor, had gone to Howard University or Morehouse as an example, and we had informal networks amongst the people of color at Proctor, where they weren't. This is in the age before ERGs, but we did have informal networks where we would get together and support each other at that time. And I think working for companies like P&G or Pepsi Cola, because they're such global companies, P&G at the time, I think 50% of their revenue was outside the United States. And so they truly did have this global perspective and appreciated and recognized the need to have people in those particular countries and territories around the world to adapt the brands of Procter & Gamble and make them relevant in those countries. And so I think I was fortunate to work for a company like Procter & Gamble who really recognized that, who valued it, who supported these different initiatives to become more diverse and to have a workforce that was more representative of who their consumers were, as an example, having them be a consumer-focused brand. I think they saw the shifting demographics in America and knew that they had to have people within the organization that understood the consumer and where the consumer was going. So I was really very fortunate to work there at again, Procter, Clorox, and Pepsi, because I think all those companies recognized that early on and started making efforts to make sure that their organizations were becoming more diverse and inclusive.
The diversity versus equity paper, we found that the most diverse of the 244 Fortune 500 companies studied were also the least equitable in terms of advancing racial minorities. So basically, these companies that are hiring, the BIPOC folks from Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, it doesn't really mean that they're going to be promoted necessarily or have executive roles. So what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I've seen the data on this, and I can share my perspective on why I think this is happening. I think many companies recognize the need to become more diverse, and many companies have committed to becoming more diverse. And that, in essence, and that really matters, right? As I talked about early on, it does have an impact on how you feel about an organization when you enter into an organization and you don't see other people that look like you as peers, as managers, as senior leaders. And so companies recognize, particularly over the last several years, that is something that has to happen. I think, and you can do that through recruitment activities, and you can do that through aggressive hiring and sourcing. And it's not, again, it requires work. And I think many companies have done the work to say, how do we improve our numbers here to get more diverse? What I think some companies underestimate, quite frankly, though, is it's a start to get your organization to look more diverse. Creating equity and focusing on the inclusion of those people, is also required. So I'm sure you've heard the phrase, which is, diversity is being asked to the dance, inclusion is being asked to dance, right? And there's a big difference. And you can have people sitting around the table, or you can have people in the building, but if they're not really being sought out to provide their perspective, to provide their opinion, to lead and to own and to run things, then you're not going to be successful in retaining that talent. You're not going to be successful in developing that talent and ensuring that talent feels good about the work that they're doing. And there are things that we can do as managers to ensure that happens, to ensure that when you're in a meeting, you look around the room and you make sure that there are diverse voices in that room, and that one of the things I try to do and that we do as an organization here at the NBA is you're in that room for a reason. And what we try to do, and certainly I do this, is I pay attention to who is speaking and who's not speaking. And I always give people the opportunity at the end. I kind of go around the room and say, what do you think? What do you think? So that everyone has an opportunity to actually voice their opinion, to contribute. And it's actually so amazing that, sometimes the person who has been absorbing it and has been listening to the whole conversation, they have some of the most insightful things to say, but perhaps they were hesitant to say it. But by creating an environment and a safe space to allow them to contribute and to say what's on their mind, it really does, I think, enrichen the conversation and gets other people to think differently. So there's a difference between, making sure that your organization looks diverse and then truly including people in the conversation, in the discussion, in the decision-making. And I think that that's what organizations have to continue to work on and create that environment where you're taking advantage of the diverse voices and experiences within your organizations.
Well, in order for us to advance, how do we show our intentional allyships within our communities? I mean, we should be uplifting one another and actually getting people who look like us into those dream or advanced leadership roles. But how do we show up for each other in the workplace?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think that, as I've said before, these values of diversity, inclusion, equality, respect, these are critical values. And every single racial minority actually does have challenges, and we, have to collectively understand and support each other. I will tell you some of the work that was done that I think about the communities coming together, for example, are around things like Asian hate. And I remember that our Dream in Color ERT and our Apex ERT sort of came together on these. And I know that there were other, Black organizations that came together with Asian organizations to say, hey, how do we deal with these issues here as a collective group and supporting each other in those efforts? That's happening in the workplace. It's happening, again, in society. And I think it's critical that we all sort of work together to ensure that no group gets left behind here. And again, I think it's important that organizations have to recognize that each one of us has different challenges, and there are different things that that each one of our individual groups are dealing with. Where companies can really play a part is ensuring that those differences are actually listened to, are heard, and that companies are actually dealing with and addressing those. And so, I think we have to continue to support each other. We have to continue to advocate for making sure that our organizations are diverse, but again, inclusive, in listening to different perspectives. And I think it's critical that we all work together on that.
Thank you, Franco and Mark, so much for the insightful conversation about the fact that while some companies are hiring for diversity, it doesn't mean that it's being translated in higher levels of employment. Read more of Ascend's findings from the Diversity versus Equity paper by visiting ascendleadership.org. Thanks for listening to API Futures, presented by Ascend, where we empower global leaders of tomorrow.